Let's review the authentication architecture for traditional ASP.NET MVC applications. So let's say we're just using a plain old MVC application with Razor views rendered on the server. How does the authentication work in this kind of application? Well, when the user logs in, we validate their user ID and password, and if they're valid, we'll issue what we call an authentication ticket. In this ticket, we often have a user ID and an expiration date as an encrypted string. So we put this ticket in a cookie and return it to the client. Now this cookie is sent to the server with every subsequent request. So if you want to protect an action, we simply apply the authorized attribute to that action. When ASP.NET Runtime receives a request, it checks for the existence of this attribute on an action. So if the attribute is there, then ASP.NET will extract the authentication ticket from the authentication cookie, and then it will decrypt the ticket, and if it's valid, it will allow access to the target action. We have a very similar architecture when building single-page applications with ASP.NET Core and Angular. There are only two differences here. First is that instead of authentication tickets, we use JSON Web Tokens. A JSON Web Token, or JWT for short, is basically a JSON object that includes some data or some attributes about a user. We refer to these attributes as claims or statements about that user. As an analogy, think of your driving license or your passport. On your driving license, you have your name, your date of birth, your address, and this driving license is somehow signed or protected using some technology, so it cannot be duplicated. A JSON Web Token is exactly the same. So it's an object with a bunch of key value pairs, each representing something about a user, like their user ID, their name, their employment number, and so on. It also has a digital signature that prevents this token from being tampered by a hacker. So if a hacker tries to modify the values in this token to represent someone else, the validation process will fail, because this signature is created based on the content of this token. So if you change any of these values, the signature will no longer be valid. And the only party that can create this signature is the issuer or the server. Because on the server, we have a private key that is used to generate this digital signature. Unless a hacker can get the private key, they cannot digitally sign these tokens. So the first difference between an authentication ticket and a JSON Web Token is that in a JSON Web Token, we have multiple attributes about a user, not just their IDs. We can have their name, their email, their employment number, and so on. And with these, we don't have to query the database every time we need this information. We can simply extract these values from the JSON Web Token. And by the way, none of these attributes include private or sensitive data like a user's password or credit card number. We only have some basic information about the user, just like your passport. It's an ID. Now, the second difference between the new authentication scheme and the traditional one is that here we don't use cookies, because cookies are only available in browsers. Chances are we may want to build other types of clients for our API, like an iOS or an Android app. So instead, we put the JSON Web Token in the request header and send it to the server. Now, in terms of the storage, if you're building a browser app, we typically store this token in the local storage of the browser. So all modern browsers have this local storage, which is a simple database that can store simple key value pairs. If you're building an iOS or an Android app, we'll store this token somewhere else on the device. Again, each platform has a simple storage for storing simple values. So there's no cookie involved. We simply get a JSON object from the server, and then we can decide where to store it. So this is the big picture. Now, building all this infrastructure is very tedious. For every application, we need to build a registration form, a login form, generate and validate tokens, control access to API endpoints. It's a lot of repetitive work. So that's where Auth0 comes in the picture. We can delegate all this to Auth0. I've covered Auth0 in my advanced Angular course called Build Enterprise Apps with Angular. But in this section, I'm going to review some of the key points that you need to know. So from the next lecture, we're going to start implementing the authentication.